Goeiedag, good day, fellow South Africans and citizens of the world. And you know, through this channel, I communicate with several thousand people a year. And there's an inner circle, as I call it, which is probably a few hundred people that I probably talk to every month. And there's an even smaller circle, and a lot of them I don't talk about, but one of these people is Jane. Now, Jane lives in the UK. She's a wonderfully generous lady. She often donates large amounts of money to charities that this channel supports, and it's a huge shout out to Jane. And she sent me an email, and like me, she's an old fart. Okay, we're both old farts. I know Jane won't take that offensively because it is what it is. But she says, in the mid-1970s, my first husband, Richard Grant, and I decided to go to Zambia in darkest Africa, formerly Northern Rhodesia. We had not been able to gather enough money for a deposit to put down on a house owing to the meteoric rise in property prices in 1971, 1972. Now, just for the record, Jane, I was still at boarding school then. But I was still at boarding school. So Jane is obviously a little bit older than me. Oh, she's a lovely lady. Anyway, she says, my husband, who was an industrial engineer, obtained a 3-year contract to work on the copper mines in Zambia. The pay was good. I could work as well. With a gratuity at the end of 3 years, we hoped to return to the UK with enough money for a deposit on a house. Our first taste of Africa came on the flight out in a DC-8. Remember those old DC-8 planes? Wow. I feel like I'm going right back to the dark ages here, Jane. Anyway, because I used to do the fuck of friendship stuff. At the back of the aircraft was a group of Africans, Zambians, who were obviously drinking and getting rowdier by the minute. Consequently, we did not get much sleep that night. This is on a plane. On arrival in Lusaka, the capital of Zambia, we boarded a local flight to Ndola on the Copper Belt, and from there we were driven to Chilabombwe. Translation, place of the croaking frog, which was formerly named Bancroft. The name Croaking Frog was given to the town as the Konkola mine was the second wettest mine in the world, pumping out 80,000 gallons of water a day, hence a large population of very large African frogs. And they were noisy, I believe it. We were taken to our allocated house built on bricks with a corrugated iron roof. We could see instantly that it was not for us, being on a busy road and with a beaten earth surround. It had previously been inhabited by a Zambian family, and Zambians are not famed for their gardening skills. We immediately set out for the mine officers to complain and to ask for allocation of another house. The roads were lined with scarlet flamboyant trees, and the chirruping noise of the cicadas was deafening. We walked into the first office we found, with a mine accountant, a South African by the name of Bokkie Swanepoel, who was sitting with a newspaper on his chest and not much else. He directed us to an office across the lawn where Mrs. Carol Maritz, the personnel officer responsible for settling in expatriates, was sitting. She was very sympathetic, and after consulting her records, took us to number 20 Luapula Avenue, a respectable house on a quiet road and with a well-stocked garden, including 2 avocado pears trees and lots of colourful bougainvillea shrubs. The house's former inhabitants had been the previous personnel manager, Mr. Wilson, and his family. We took on Mr. Wilson's house servant, John Mbanga, who doubled up as a gardener and who proved to be a good worker. Prior to leaving the UK, We had attended an induction lecture where we were told what to expect and in particular what to avoid. We were advised when around large areas of water not to try to enter the water, as in the water live snails which can infect us with liver fluke and bilharzia. Also, many lakes contain crocodiles, so the message was avoid water at all cost. There were always those who ignored such warnings, and one expatriate did so, and it cost him his life. Just before he arrived in Chilabambombe, he went water skiing and was taken by a croc. What made it all the more tragic was his parents witnessed the incident, having come to Zambia to visit him and his family. My husband started work straight away in the work-study unit. His project was to carry out a study of the bus service. This entailed travelling around a busload of Zambians in the heat of the day, quite an experience in a small space, with people who have never heard of deodorants. The head of the work-study unit was a Mr. Williams. He had ginger hair and was nicknamed Golden Balls by his staff. October was known as Suicide Month, as it was so hot. It was when the sun was right overhead on its passage from the equator to the southern tropic, which ran through Rhodesia, south of Zambia. Considering this one day in October, I went into the garden at noon and noted with interest that I had no shadow, only a small pool of shade around my feet. I also had a work permit, fortunately, as wives on the copper belt were unable to obtain one. We had insisted on my having one prior to leaving the UK. Initially, there was no vacancy available to me here on the mine, so I stayed at home for 6 weeks. I found this very difficult, as I was not used to having a servant in the house. I would sit in the living room as John cleaned the bedroom and bathroom. Then he would come in to clean the living room, so then I would have to go and sit in the bedroom. All very awkward. We had not been there for very long when one night the Zambian shift boss, who lived next door, came home one evening and found his wife and her extended family having a party. He threw them all out into the street, and they sat in the road, crying and wailing, which Africans do very well. Needless to say, there was another night when we did not get much sleep. After 6 weeks, I was given a job in the mine, typing pool. There I had the use of an electric typewriter for the first time. It took some time getting used to it. I kept typing fast and making mistakes. After a few weeks, I was given the post as secretary to the mine and engineering superintendents. I sat in an office with their officers on either side of me. A large part of my time was spent on the telephone trying to get through to Kitwe, the largest town on the copper belt. The telephone service was dreadful, and I could sit for ages just dialing and dialing. Each month I had to operate a large and very complicated machine which calculated the previous day's copper extraction for the mine manager, Mr. Hunter. I took over the job from Patty Swanepoel, wife of Boki, whom we had already met on our first day. She complained bitterly to me about the wife of the mine superintendent, David Lendrum. I discovered in due course that this was because she was having an affair with Dave. Dave Lendrum had arrived at the mine from South Africa and was taken on as a general underground lasher. I discovered this in my office. I came across a file of personnel appraisal documents which gave such details. Bill Powell, the engineering superintendent, had been a plumber. There was a lot of similar cases of meteoric rises to fame. Ken Christian, the mine secretary, had been a shirt salesman. Steve Maritz, husband of the aforementioned Carol Maritz, was a mine captain. He had been a nuts and bolts salesman. This was very frustrating for the young expats, i.e. expatriates, from the UK, who all had university degrees, to find that they had to report to someone who were not qualified for the job they were doing. The aim of Nichanga Consolidated Copper Mines Limited was to Zambians as much jobs as possible. The first post to be given to a Zambian was that of a personnel manager, as it was considered the simplest and easiest management position. His name was Mr. Malama, and he sat in an office behind a large desk wearing a collar and tie. On the desk was a newspaper and a glass of water and nothing else. It was generally known that his secretary, a South African lady by the name of Carol Antle, did all the personnel work together with Carol Maritz. Her husband, Theo Antle, was a shift boss. The next step up from a shift boss was mine captain. There was only one Zambian mine captain who was not a great success. One day, number 1 shaft started to flood. He switched off the lights and told everyone to go home. When we arrived at the mine, we were given a setting, an allowance, and a car loan. I had failed my driving test in the UK when I nearly knocked down a friend of the examiner. Good one, Jane. That's a good way to impress people. So I had to take a test in Zambia. I was forewarned about what to expect. The reversing test was done by reversing between 2 rows of oil drums, first from one side and then from the other. Somehow I managed the interesting procedure. The parking was carried out by reversing between 2 vehicles, whether they existed or not. I had been forewarned about this by fellow expats. On my test there were no parked vehicles, so I pretended they were and reversed between the 2 invisible cars. The hill start was a farce, as there were no hills to speak of in the townships. Thankfully, I passed the test, as being able to drive was a necessity in Zambia. Soon after we arrived, a married couple came out from the UK, Nigel and Beth Bailey. Nigel was an industrial engineer and worked in the same office as my husband. After a few months, the mine hospital secretary resigned, and because Nigel had carried out work studies in a hospital, he was given the job. Beth Bailey was very indignant as having to take a driving test. She was I got to tell you guys, I'm not going to tell you about my driving test experience. I tried several times. I was hopeless. But that was in South Africa. Okay, getting back to Beth. She was warned that she had to be very polite as the examiner was a Zambian. When she got into the car to be tested, she said, "Now look here, my man, I have been driving in the UK for several years. I do not need to take a test." The examiner immediately said, "How? You have failed." End of test. However, she continued to drive the township in a small Fiat, waving to friends through the open sunroof. Zambia followed South Africa in having traffic cops. These were like traffic wardens, but with more powers. They were Zambians and used to enjoy pulling over expat motorists in order to find faults with their motor vehicles. This was not difficult in a country where there was a significant lack of spare parts for cars. There were a number of crazy stories, but the one I can remember is when an expat was stopped by a traffic cop who wanted to see if his windscreen wipers worked. They didn't. No spare parts. So thinking quickly, he said, "Oh, they're a new type. They only work when it's raining and the windscreen is wet." I'm sorry, guys. I think that's quite funny. Oh, the cop replied, "Oh, that's all right then." Another favourite gambit was to stand at a stop street in order to see if the handbrakes were being applied, as it was against the regulations to stop without doing so. My husband was caught in this way and had to spend a night in jail. The police took his passport away and wanted mine, but he managed to persuade them not to take it. He was then fined the next day, came home, took off all his clothes in the garden and washed himself under the standpipe before entering the house, as the jail was so dirty. One matter that was drummed into the expats was that they were to be very polite to the Zambians. One evening in a bar, a workmate of Richard's, a very immature young man, referred to Zambians as monkeys. He was thrown into jail and for several weeks was brought to court, but each time the matter was adjourned. Eventually it was referred to the Supreme Court in Lusaka. On the way there was an accident and the car left the road. 3 of the occupants were killed, the lawyer and 2 expats. The accused survived. He was eventually fined and given a suspended sentence, whereupon he fled to South Africa. It was commonly thought amongst the expats that the vehicle had been deliberately shunted off the road. One of the deceased expats also worked with Richard, a very nice young man by the name of Pete Holder. Not long after we arrived on the mine, we acquired 2 dogs from an expat who was leaving. Fairly soon, one started to show signs of distemper. The nearest vet was in Kitwe, a small town about 40 kilometers away. I put the dog into our car and took John with me. It was not long after I had passed my test, so I was rather nervous. The roads were in not good condition, and on each side was a wide space of untamed road. Vehicles would overtake me on the left, and I said to John, "Look, John, how dangerous is that?" "How? That is not good." One house servant, John, would lament the passing of British colonial rule and advent of independence. He referred to it as before time. He would say, "Before time we had good bicycles, i.e. BSA. Now we have flying pigeons, which are always breaking down." This was a reference to Chinese goods, which had flooded the market with the arrival of the Chinese, who were engaged in building the Tanzam Railway. Other substandard Chinese goods included baked beans, which were described by expats who had sampled them as little bullets. Yuck. And Africa has been Chinatized, so good luck with that. Anyway, carrying on with Jane's story. She says, there weren't many programs on television on the Zambian Broadcasting Service. It was very rudimentary. However, one show was very amusing. It was a quiz show called The Money or the Box. In one episode, a Mr. Finn, or Phiri, being the equivalent of Smith, was answering questions. The last question was, "Mr. Phiri, who is the president of the Zambia?" Mr. Phiri proceeded to think, thought for a while, picked his nose, and finally replied, "The president of the Zambia is President Kaunda." "Very good, Mr. Phiri. Would you like to the money or the box?" Mr. Phiri, once again in deep thought. All the time the fat African mamas in the audience were shouting, "Bokkies, bokkies," and making big square signs by waving their arms about. Eventually Mr. Phiri said, "I want the box." The box was open, and inside was a bicycle pump. Mr. Phiri gazed at it in disbelief and shouted, "I want the money." The main drawback to living in Zambia was the shortage of food in the shops. Now, this is what we're talking about. You know, the attacks on the trucking industry by these African thugs on the road, Eskom, the issues there, shops closing down. This is going to be the huge issue in 2020 in South Africa. Okay, let's get back to this. The main drawback to living in Zambia was the shortage of food in the shops. One could never eat chips, as potatoes and cooking oil were never available at the same time. Having come from the UK where just before he left, the fact that Andrex toilet rolls were temporarily off the market was considered a national disaster. This was a shock to our system. In Zambia, we were lucky if we were able to buy toilet rolls at all. And then there were the cheapest type and non-absorbent. Items would suddenly disappear from the shelves, and when they reappeared, all the wives rushed to stock up, with the inevitable result. The locally made bread had a greyish tinge. If one had the right contacts, fruit and vegetables could be obtained from the mine farm. One had to be very careful when buying groceries, as many were past their sell-by date. I had a stomach upset nearly every month as a result of this. After 6 months of living under these difficult conditions, we decided that no way could we endure 3 years of it, so we began to plan our getaway. Richard was on a 3-year contract with NCCM and had to serve 18 months before he had earned enough gratuity to equal what it had cost the mine to bring us out to Zambia. And so it was only at that point in time that he could resign. So we decided to leave by doing a moonlight flit. Expat friends advised us to go to South Africa, as life in the UK at that time was difficult, with a Labour government in power, a weak economy and strikes, whereas there was plenty of opportunities for work in South Africa. We were told that we should go to Durban, which is very English and was regarded as the last outpost of the British Empire. That sounded good, and after the privations of living in Zambia, that really appealed to us. A friend was close to completing his 3-year contract and was going to relocate to Durban. He offered to include his household goods, a trunk of our goods, which made it possible for us to leave with all our possessions. We opened an account at Barclays Bank in Durban and started to send funds there, as we were allowed to remit a certain portion of our salaries out of the country. As I worked, I also counted as a deserter. Sorry, my eyes. MF Day arrived and a friend picked us up from our house at 7 a.m. and drove us to Ndola Airport. We flew to Lusaka, where we had some time to prepare, so we decided to have something to eat. We found a snack bar where we were told that we could have something as long as it was a cheese sandwich. I have to tell you that back in 1986, when I left South Africa, I left via, believe it or not, Harare. I had to fly from Johannesburg to Harare and then from Harare to Perth. And the only thing that they had in the Harare airport was these, what they called sandwiches. And the bread was kind of, you know when bread goes really dry, it sort of folds up. And there was a bit of really crappy looking dry ham between the two. And they called that a ham sandwich. And I decided to just go hungry. Anyway, let's get back to this. From there, we caught a Zambian Airways flight to Blantyre in Malawi. At Blantyre, we boarded a South African Airways flight to Johannesburg. What bliss, a European crew and as much good quality food and drink as we could manage. Those were the days, guys. Those were the days. I cannot describe how wonderful it was to be back in civilization. On the aircraft, I had a window seat, and gazing down on Mozambique, Rhodesia, and the northern Transvaal, I saw roads stretching straight through the bush as far as the eye could see. Amazing. Now, I'm sure, Jane, that was on a Fokker friendship, because that's what I used to see as a young kid going to school when I travelled down from East Africa to South Africa. Anyway. She says, amazing. MMBA, as it was referred to by expats, MMBA equals miles and miles of bloody Africa. In Joburg, we caught a flight to Durban, where we arrived at 5 p.m. We had a bank draft payable to the Lonsdale Hotel, and so we booked in there. One of my memories of the hotel is being in our room when out of the corner of my eye I saw a creature scuttle under the bed. I said, "Look, Richard, a mouse." He replied with a smile, "No, Jane, that's a cockroach." They make them big in Durban. After a while, I got used to seeing these outsized creatures in the street of Durban. We had arrived in South Africa in February, which was summer there, and it was very hot and humid as it was a rainy season. One only had to think of doing something simple like brushing one's teeth, and one started to perspire. One of our first priorities was to find somewhere to live, and we moved into a flat in the North Beach area of Durban. The other was to find jobs. Richard, being well qualified, found a job quite quickly with a local brick manufacturer, Coronation Bricks. I remember Coronation Bricks so well. I signed on with an agency where I had an interview with a young lady who told me that she came from Bristol, not far from my home town of Bath. "Yes," she said, "we're all here," which immediately made me feel at home. I was given a job as a secretary with a finance company called Stanek. That's Standard Bank's a finance arm of Standard Bank. I remember that. We took our job offers to the office of the Department of Internal Affairs, equivalent of our Home Office, where we were intrigued to find we were classified as aliens, making us feel like beings from outer space. A very friendly South African lady processed our applications. She handed us our work permits with a big smile and said, "Welcome to South Africa." So began a very rewarding and enjoyable life in South Africa. Now, of course, Jane's talking about way back before 1994. And look, I love these sort of stories because they kind of give context to what's happening in South Africa today. You know, it is tragic what is going on, and people who were born or were too young to realize how things used to be in South Africa need to know that what is happening in South Africa today is terribly wrong. And of course, the ANC government are the criminals in all this. Alright guys, please remember to subscribe to be kept informed. Ring the bell for the updates. Please like this video, please share this video, and above all, stay safe. And Jane, have a Merry Christmas from me, and to all my many subscribers around the world, please have a happy, merry and safe Christmas. And let's see how we can help people in South Africa in 2020, which I think is going to be a very, very dangerous and difficult year. Alright guys, take care.